Now the engagement is going to be beginning in just a few minutes here, our third and final battle of the weekend. Prior to that, I'll just give you a brief rundown in case you missed the events yesterday. So the campaign of 1813 in Niagara for the Americans actually began very well. They landed at Fort George, captured it with the support of the United States Navy. It was a brilliant victory for the Americans, and they pretty much chased the British all the way up here. The British had a fortified camp about at Burlington Heights, which is about where Dundurn Castle is today. The Americans, seeing the strength of the position and their men being quite tired after the long march, they decided to make camp along the Stoney Creek with the plan that they would attack it upon receiving reinforcements. Their camp had been so poorly laid out, though, that the British hazarded to attack them in the dead of the night with about 800 men. And their attack, though heavy losses on the British, they were able to disorganize the Americans and actually capture their two commanding generals. Come the next morning, they held a council of war, and the decision was made that they would retreat back towards Fort George, hopefully under the protection of the United States Navy, and regroup there for further orders. So today's engagement is going to be speaking about the American retreat, falling back, and we'll get into that in just a few minutes. The battle is going to be fluid. It's going to be moving across the field, so don't worry. Wherever you are, you're going to get some front and center action throughout the engagement. You don't need to follow it. You can just watch it go by back and forth. So it'll be a nice and dynamic engagement. As I mentioned earlier, the American command had been captured during the Battle of Stoney Creek. So in lieu of a command structure, they actually held a council of officers. They elected a new leader, actually a colonel of the Dragoons, who made the decision to begin to withdraw back, believing that they needed to fall back on reinforcements and that they needed to fall back to the support of the United States Navy. The naval support off the lake had been key for their advance up here and for the capturing of Fort George, so this entirely made sense in the eyes of the Americans and really in the eyes of a modern viewer as well. The strength of the British was unknown, but if they were willing to make such an attack in the dead of the night, the fear was that the British had a much stronger force in place than what was actually there. So the American forces entering now, there's a mix of regulars and some militia there. Militia was a huge component of the armies of both sides. Militia service was mandatory military service for any adult male. In the United States, it was 18 to 40. In Canada, it was 16 to 60. And in order to be part of it, you'd have to come out and do training during peacetime. I use the term training extremely lightly because training for the militia usually meant coming out on a holiday, such as the King's birthday or the 4th of July, and you would prove to the local military authorities that you could do a little bit of drill, that you could properly handle a musket, and that you could load and fire it without assistance. Upon completion of this, they would open up their stores to you, which meant free beer for the rest of the day. So that's a pretty good way to open up your training. But because it was on a holiday, you'd bring your whole family with you because there'd be food, there'd be partying, they'd have fireworks at night. It was a big festival more than anything. This didn't work initially for training, but when war breaks out, militia are called up for anywhere from 30 days to a full year of service, during which they would receive proper training. And in the hands of a good soldier, militia were quite capable. One militia regiment, the Incorporated Militia of Upper Canada, they're out on the field today. I'll point them out when we see them. They were actually claimed by 1814 by some British officers to be the finest light infantrymen that he had ever seen. And American militia, they performed well in many engagements. It was mostly American militia standing behind the barricades at New Orleans that pushed back British regulars. So don't underestimate the militia. Now, as the Americans were falling back, and any time you're falling back from an enemy, you have to employ a rear guard. These are troops that are going to help delay the enemy so that your own forces can quickly move back and reorganize. They weren't expected to stand and fight. The idea was fire, retreat, hold them up at natural obstacles such as bridges or creeks, streams, things like that. Just a way to slow your enemy down. And the Americans faced an issue during the retreat, and not only were they dealing with the British regulars and the Canadians coming after them, but also the Six Nations were beginning to come out as well in force. Prior to this, most of the Six Nations had actually been asked to return back to the Grand River. There's always one show off, every event. But the Six Nations, because of the fear of the American advance, there was a concern that if they put all of their forces in at Burlington Heights, that the Americans could attack the Grand River and it would have been left open. And same as well, if they tried to defend Grand River, they would leave the Burlington encampment open. So the decision was made for the Iroquois to defend the Grand River, the British and the Canadians to defend Burlington. But now with the American threat falling back, these two forces converged and pushed onto the Americans.
Yeah, me and him are since we were here. Hey, if you go high too, you'll be able to see.
Bang! Now, you will know some of the Americans are in gray instead of the traditional American blue. One of the problems that the American Army faced was a supply issue throughout the war, especially when it came to blue dye. The price of blue dye had skyrocketed during the war. By the end of the war, it was 15 times its pre-war price to get blue dye. And one of the major reasons is because the Americans had declared war on their blue dye supplier. So it became very difficult for the homespun industry to make up that deficit. So many troops had to make do without the traditional blue. They simplified their uniforms. You saw brown uniforms, green, black, white, and gray was very popular in the Niagara. In fact, the gray jackets were work jackets issued to the Americans. And initially, the Americans did not care to wear the gray. They referred to it as a laborer jacket. And these are men of the Republic. They shouldn't wear what somebody wears to clean a stable. But gray-coated American troops did something in 1814 that not even Napoleon Bonaparte could have pulled off, and that was meet the British in equal numbers on an open battlefield and beat them. At the Battle of Chippewa, American regulars in gray defeated the British out on the open field, and that kind of was the birth of a professional United States Army. And if you don't believe me about the legacy, you can just go and visit West Point Academy and tell me what color the uniforms are there, because they don't wear blue, they wear gray. Gray is the color of a professional American Army. Now, I gotta ask, there's some good, loyal Canadians in the crowd, right? Excellent. Well, you will be pleased to know that on the battlefield right now, we have a regiment that historically was 100% Canadian out on the field. So feel free to give them a cheer if you want. I kind of led you into that because they're fighting for the Americans. Oh. In 1813, the Americans raised a regiment, 153 strong, called the Canadian Volunteers. The Canadian Volunteers can easily be spotted because they wore green hat bands and white cockades. These were purposely worn as a sort of challenge towards the British, green hat bands being a sign of free Ireland, and the white cockades being a symbol of the Jacobite rebellions. So they were very antagonistic, and in fact, many of their officers had standing arrest warrants on their head and had been tried in absentia, which meant if captured, they were allowed to be executed immediately. Their commander, Joseph Wilcox, and this is just to remind you, you think you got problems with Parliament? He was actually a sitting member of the legislature when he took up his commission with the American Army. He even burned his constituency down in December of 1813, the village of Newark, today Niagara-on-the-Lake. But don't worry, he got his end. In 1814, he was killed during the siege of Fort Erie and received the best ending you could hope for as a Canadian traitor, and that's an unmarked grave in Buffalo. That's right. Artillery was an important part of even a chase and engagement. Light guns could be pulled up by horses quickly unlimbered, and men could man them and fire away. Now today, for safety standards, we take time between the shots. We observe a lot more safety steps than they did, but historically, you can load and fire a cannon just about as quickly as you can load and fire a musket, which is about 20 seconds. Most cannons would have fired a solid iron cannonball across the battlefield, and they would have fired at a nice low angle so it skipped across the battlefield and plow through ranks of soldiers. Light guns like these, they did testing at the time and found they could pass through as many as 17 human beings. So absolutely devastating. At close range, you might even switch to a different type of shot called canister or case. Imagine, if you will, a burlap sack or tin can filled with lead balls or even iron balls about the size of a grape or golf ball. You'd fire it off and turn the cannon into a shotgun. At close range, this would chew through men, and reports of the time period said it sounded like locusts descending upon the pharaohs of Egypt, and when it struck men, it sounded like fabric being torn. Absolutely devastating. Now, as the battle is engaging, you're going to see one of the problems out in the field is smoke. The weapons of the era are flintlock smoothbore muskets for the most part. Flintlock means that it uses a piece of flint striking against a piece of steel to ignite powder in a side pan, which then would travel through a touch hole and ignite the main charge. That also means it's exposed to the elements. So forever prayed extra hard at Sunday service, thanks for letting the rain up, because if it had been raining hard, these are sticks, not firearms. The other issue is being smoothbore, accuracy is a problem. You can kill a man at 200 yards, but you could miss them by as much as 18 feet in any direction. So the idea was to get them to work properly and to be useful, fire them en masse. Those large volleys would mean that somebody with a working musket hit something, even at a distance. But this then produces those walls of smoke out on the field. Visibility could be severely hampered. Most engagements, once it got hot, you couldn't see your enemy until about 30 to 40 paces away. At Lundy's Lane, they were as far as I am from these lovely folks, and they couldn't see anything. So a lot of people like to ask, why the bright red uniform and the white shoot me here X? Well, it's simple. When you step out of the smoke, you want uniforms that scream out to your friends, don't shoot me. So the British wore red because it was the cheapest dye they had available when they picked the color, and the Americans wore blue because that's what the French gave them in the Revolution. So red versus blue is great, but the men in gray, the men in green, they have to worry about everybody shooting them. And friendly fire was a serious issue throughout the war. In fact, during the engagement at Stoney Creek, there is record of an American cavalry unit charging in the darkness and in the smoke, and it wasn't until they had already been hacking and slashing away that they realized they were attacking their own men. So as much as we like to think of camouflage is a great idea, 200 years ago, as they would say, it could make you a landowner. You can see every once in a while some of the soldiers out there are having misfires. Again, that is the difficulty of the weapon. If it's damp, windy, rainy, that's going to affect it. After firing, black powder relieves a lot of fouling behind, and that can gum the whole thing up. So if you get misfires, there's different ways you can try to fix it. One of the big problems is you might get it where the powder in the pan goes off, but it does not ignite the main charge. This is called a flash in the pan. It's all show, but nothing of consequence really happens. For that, you'd have to clear the touch hole, so hopefully your next shot will ignite the main charge. The other problem is your flint may get worn down and get dull. You may have to sharpen it by taking a metal tool and tapping on the end. This is called napping. Now, it is very important you do not let your opponent see you when you are napping your flint. because if you're napping, you can't shoot back. So as they would say at the time, and we still say today, don't get caught napping. Now, in and amongst the smoke, you can see the British have brought some flags out onto the battlefield. These are colors. In both the British and the American Army, every regiment had colors that they would bring out onto the field at times, and the colors had an importance to them. Not only did they represent a regimental history being shown before you, every regiment getting a unique set, they also would act as center rally points. So if something went wrong, that's where you went to. Is often where the command was situated as well. So they were important for all these reasons. But a lot of times they held not just an importance on the battlefield, but an almost religious significance to the soldiers of the regiment. And the men defending them were told to stand their ground and defend them to the death or beyond. And there is intense heroism of the young officers who carried these flags. Most of the men who carried the flags were ensigns, who were often teenagers. And an excellent example of the bravery was a 19-year-old in Spain who got surrounded by French lancers. They demanded his surrender, he refused, and they attacked. They stabbed him, they slashed him, they severed his right arm, gashed the top of his head, and trampled him with the horses. And he still did not give up the colors, tearing them off the staff and holding them under his body so the enemy could not take them. Not only was he successful in defending the colors, he actually survived and lived well into his older years. But unfortunately for some ensigns, they were not so fortunate. The ensign of the 49th Regiment of Foot, who was only about 15 years old during the Battle of Stoney Creek, was actually killed during the engagement, helping to lead the men into battle. Now, the American withdrawal back to Fort George began in relatively good order, but two things quickly worked against them. Their command structure having been interrupted meant that confusion began to get through them when they were pressed by the enemy. The other problem, as I mentioned, Six Nations had begun to get heavily involved, and their attacks terrified many of the Americans. This is because many of the Americans had never seen an Indigenous person before, and they grew up on the myth. They grew up believing that they were monsters and demons out in the woods. And we know that to be false, but they did not. So when they heard the war cries coming across the field, they suddenly realized the boogeyman was very real and was coming for them. Just the fear alone was enough to whip some American troops into a fervor to either surrender or flee the field. The Battle of Beaver Dams fought not long after this. The American army of 600 was whipped into surrender by less than 40 British regulars, but I only give them credit because they showed up at the end. It was men of the 7 nations out of Quebec and the 6 nations, about 300 of them, who through their actions drove them into such fear that when the British showed up, the Americans asked for them to take their surrender, to spare them the slaughter they feared. If you are a Canadian and you're happy about it in the Niagara, you make sure you say thank you to the Iroquois, because if it wasn't for the Indigenous, we would be standing in a state right now.
Didn't mean to bug him.
Now you will notice some of the troops on the British side are wearing a green uniform. I mentioned about the Incorporated Militia for Canada that they're one of the Redcoat regiments. While most of the militia did not receive uniforms, small numbers of them did, such as the Incorporated Militia, and such as this green-coated unit, which is the 2nd York. raised out of the Toronto area. In 1813, many of the militia who could get uniforms were issued green coats and blue trousers to give them a uniform appearance out on the battlefield. As the war progressed, many of these uniforms were replaced with the traditional British red.
That went to World War I. They're like, oh no, we're all being blown up. Guys, we have machine guns now.
Yeah, exactly.
As the engagement goes on, you can hear the officers shouting orders up and down. Officers in both the United States and British military tended to come from the upper classes simply because it was too expensive for anybody else. Officers were expected to purchase their own uniforms, weapons, equipment, pretty much everything. And it begs the question, why spend all this money to get shot at? Well, the fact of the matter is, for a lot of the British men who are becoming officers, they weren't the eldest son. The eldest son got the inheritance. Little brother gets a commission in the army, and he's off on his own. But a good and courageous British soldier can win land, title, promotion, all sorts of prizes, and become very rich and powerful. And an excellent example from this era is a 17-year-old who had two hobbies, getting drunk and playing the fiddle. But by the end of his military career, he was a lord, a duke, a viscount, knighted by the king, a field marshal in the British Army, had titles from 11 different European countries, and a wealth that today would exceed 40 billion pounds. Not bad for a guy who started as a drunk who liked to play the fiddle. But by that point, he preferred to be known by his newer title, and that was the Duke of Wellington. Now, for Americans, it was a little bit different. You couldn't parlay it into that sort of prizes. You would usually parlay it into political power. Proof of that, 4 presidents out of the War of 1812. William Henry Harrison, Andrew Jackson, Zachary Taylor, and Sam Houston. He counts. He was president of Texas. Now, it was not uncommon, ladies and gentlemen, at the conclusion of engagements or towards the end, for officers to hold parley for the treatment of the field and the treatment of the wounded and dead on the field. Oftentimes, they'd also discuss the treatment of prisoners, and it was quite common during the War of 1812 for men, rather than being marched off to some prisoner war camp, to be granted parole. Parole was where you would give your honor that you would no longer serve until officially exchanged, but it allowed you to go back home. This not only helped your own side by allowing you to return home, but it helped the other side because they did not have to spend the resources on taking care of all these prisoners. But with the conclusion of the engagement, ladies and gentlemen, it is a tradition amongst the reenactors, as we recognize the ground we walk on was walked by many others before. The people that we portray and the people that research, they walked these grounds, they fell on these grounds, and it didn't matter if they were British, Canadian, American, Indigenous, we respect them. And it is an honor amongst us and a privilege that we give their honor to them through the playing of lament. So during the playing of the lament, I ask if you please, if you can, remove your caps and observe silence. Ladies and gentlemen, round of applause for all of the reenactors who have come out this weekend. They have traveled far and wide. Now, ladies and gentlemen, if reenacting seems like something you might be interested in, we have a few excellent ways to find out. The first is you can just talk to the reenactors. They're excellent people to talk to. Anybody who's put this much effort into a hobby wants to share it with you, so feel free to talk with them. We also have a recruiting tent set up at the end of the British camp here. Ray's down there. You can talk to him and he'll help you out with that. It's a great hobby if you enjoy hanging out with some pretty cool people and don't mind being hot and sweaty every once in a while. It's part and parcel. But there is still more going on throughout the camps. Feel free to wander through. Check out the Sutlers. They're going to be closing up at 4, so it's your last chance to walk out of here with something really cool. But other than that, ladies and gentlemen, it's been an absolute pleasure to speak with all of you. Have a great day at Stoney Creek.
It's funny because it's like,
this side is the United States Marine Corps.
the funny thing is like, oh,
And this side, the red coats are the United, well, the British.
The main reason that they wanted the British off the continent is because they're like, well, we don't want to leave them any place where they can marshal another attack and try to take it back. That's why.
Column right, eyes left, mark.
Good job, guys.